In this video, we will try to address the question of how did Britain reverse its negative trade balance with China in the 19th century. But before we address this question, we need to look at the background of Chinese-British trade and how Britain eventually developed a huge demand for tea. In 1662, Catherine, a Catholic Portuguese infanta, married Charles II of England, and she brought with her the Portuguese custom of drinking tea. She introduced the tea brewing and the preparation for tea in the English court. And eventually the English court and the English aristocracy began developing a taste for tea. Now, who was in control of the tea trade in the 17th century? It was the English East India Company, which established a monopoly on the trade with Asia and also a monopoly on tea trade with China. Now, China itself had a monopoly over the production of tea. Tea plants grew only in China, and the Chinese government tried to prevent the plants being taken out of the country because its trade was so lucrative, its tea trade with the West. China traded tea for silver. It wasn't interested in any of the English manufactured goods, and because of that, Britain had actually a negative trade balance with China. It basically meant that Britain had to pay in silver for the precious tea commodity that it was in such a high demand in Britain. People in Britain had developed a taste for tea by the early 19th century. There was huge demand, and by that period we also have the introduction of gas-powered lamps, and the streets were lit, houses were lit, and upper class people were able to enjoy longer days because of this artificial lighting, so they began having late dinners. There was a huge gap between lunch and dinner, and people began filling this gap with afternoon tea breaks. We have upper class women, aristocratic and bourgeoisie women who would have guests in the afternoon for tea. The guests would come and they would drink tea, they would socialize, they would have little snacks of sandwiches and cakes. So tea was extremely popular by the 19th century. And Britain had to figure out a way of lowering the cost of tea and at the same time meeting this huge demand for tea back home. It had to figure out a way to trade some British product in exchange for the Chinese tea. So what happened? Well, there was a turning point. And that turning point was in 1757. The British East India Company took over Bengal, and you can see it, actually you can't really see it here on the map, but it is sort of an Indian state that became eventually part of the British Empire. And Bengal was known for the production of opium. And here we have now Britain in charge of production of, or basically controlling this area which produces opium. And we will find out later on in the next video what happened next.